My name is Pamela Baird. I'm the president this year of the Mountain View Historical Association. We're very pleased to have you join us today, May 2, for our virtual meeting. And we have a wonderful program today. And Nick, are we okay to go? Okay, so Nick Perry, our past president and virtual guru, will be here in the background. If you have any problems with hearing things or seeing anything, you can put a question in the chat box and Nick will be monitoring that. Today, again, as I said, we have a very interesting program and we're so excited to have two groups join us this afternoon. Again, this is the Mountain View Historical Association, and I will give a little introduction of us. Founded in 1954 as a nonprofit, volunteer-run organization, which is dedicated to preserving and sharing the rich history of Mountain View, California. And again, this is a free program, but we encourage you to join. You can go to mountainviewhistoricalassociation.org, and there's a membership form there. And we'll put that in the chat box later at the end of our meeting, so you can see that website address. Today we have an interesting program. So we'll have two groups, and the way that the meeting will go today, we will have a 5-minute introduction by Christina Perino, followed by a 25-minute presentation by Martha Wallace, and a 25-minute presentation by Christina. And then we will have a question and answer session after that. Our participants today are the Shoreline Park. The Shoreline Park is located in Mountain View. In fact, my husband and I were bicycling there this morning. Is a 750-acre wildlife and recreation area set by the bay. The area first opened to the public in 1983. Golfing, sailing, windsurfing, and fun pastimes are available in the park. Abundant wildlife can be seen on the miles of trails that are available for jogging, hiking, and biking. And the historic Rengstorff House is located in the park. The other participant is Friends of Rengstorff House, or Friends of Our House. It was saved from destruction and then beautifully finished and restored by a community-based organization known as the Friends of Our House. The house is one of the finest examples of Victorian Italianate architecture on the West Coast. So I'd like to give you a quick profile of our two speakers today. What do I do with those? Please. So we have Christina Perino, and I had it here just a moment ago. Yikes. Well, that's embarrassing. So any case, maybe Christina, since I can't seem to locate this, maybe you can read your bio. I had it here and now I can't seem to find it. So Christina, if you could read your bio prior to your introduction, and then Martha, prior to your presentation, if you could read your bio, please. So in any case, we will start and Christina will give us a quick introduction. Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't have my bio in front of me, but I'll just start off by saying I've worked for the city of Mountain View for approximately 15 years. I am speaking to you today from the Rengstorff House. There's a picture behind me, and unfortunately didn't get to be a part of the actual restoration. I do have 2 young children and have taken them on tours or actually observations of 2 historic homes moving in nearby cities in the past couple of years, and so that's been a fun substitute. Currently, I supervise the operations and maintenance of the Rengstorff home, including our historic home docents program. I supervise other volunteers throughout Shoreline and am the direct liaison to the Rengstorff House rental program. In fact, we have a wedding going on downstairs. So exciting day, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Pam and Nick, for as well as all of the Mountain View Historical Association for providing the opportunity today. And thank you to the Friends of our House for the longstanding support. I'm pleased to be here to acknowledge the 30th anniversary of the restoration of Mountain View's oldest home. We called the presentation 30 Years of Beauty Transformed. And as you might imagine, there's an even longer history, which we'll cover today. Of course, many key restoration leaders come before us. We pay tribute to their contributions and look forward to introducing you to some of those individuals who are in attendance today. As you can see in this slide, in this next slide, let's see. Let me figure out how to move to my next screen. As you can see in this slide, Shoreline at Mountain View was officially opened to the public on July 17th, 1983. Now serving as a 750-acre wildlife and recreation area. This yellow dot right about here on the screen is where the Rengstorff House is currently located. If you were to continue, let's see, 1.8 miles around the golf course and down the road, we'll show you exactly where the house had been located long ago. And that is the site of where the original owners of the house once lived. In Martha Wallace's presentation today, you'll learn a little bit about a man named Henry Rengstorff, originally from Germany, and the role that he played. Let's see, I'm still working on my slide transitions, and the role that he played in the development of Mountain View's oldest school. You can see here at the bottom of the screen, it says circa 1965 Wisman School. Of course, Henry was also responsible for a number of other entrepreneurial activities that benefited Mountain View during this time. And in this image, you see it's dated circa 1960s Mountain View. The picture is taken along Shoreline Boulevard, which is now a commercially dense area. I think I skipped through one slide too quickly, but you can, in this timeline, you can see how things have changed over the years. Our timeline begins in 1867 when the home was built. As I introduce Martha, she will be talking about the time between 1867 and 1959. I jump in later in the presentation and take you all the way through to 1991 with a period that is very telling of Shoreline's development, a time when garbage was being delivered in an effort to raise the land. And finally, we'll conclude with the story bringing the house to the state that it is today, with some of the efforts related to the Friends of our House, interior decor, furnishings, and whatnot. So I just described the transition. You can also see at the bottom that we have set aside time for Q&A. That Q&A in crescendo fashion is a wrap up as well as an opportunity to meet several individuals who were influential in the history of the Rengstorff House in Shoreline. Those people include Jean Walker Wiley, founder of the original group that fought to save the home, Mark Rogie, Shoreline engineer, 1983 to 2000, Ginny Kaminsky, former Shoreline volunteer coordinator and current member of the Friends of Our House board. And we also know that Ken Alsman, a planning representative who will mention, is in the audience. So in case you didn't catch the announcement earlier, please feel free to type questions in to your platform for the moderator to manage, as we will do our best to accommodate questions in the last 20 minutes of today's webinar. And so, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Martha Wallace, Rengstorff House docent, Friends of Our House board member, genealogist, and historic home interpreter. Martha, if you're ready, I will go ahead and stop my share, and which leads into the Rengstorff family story.
Good afternoon. I'm a retired middle school teacher, and during the other times, I volunteer at the National Archives in San Bruno and at Rengstorff House at Shoreline and Mountain View as a docent. I'm active in genealogy groups. I teach genealogy class, and I'm secretary of the Friends of Our House. Currently, I'm guiding 2 projects for local residents to learn about the people before 1900 who owned the land where they live today. It's an exciting project. Let me introduce you to the Rengstorff House and the Rengstorff family. This is the story of a man who came to California for gold in 1850 and became an entrepreneur in Santa Clara County and the patriarch of a large family. In 1867, he purchased land where he later built a beautiful mansion. In 1829, Henry was born in Germany near Bremen and came here in 1850. He had heard about the California gold rush. He thought, I want some of that gold. He must have seen posters like this, which offered passage to California. He spent 6 months on a clipper ship, most likely the George Washington. They came around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, arriving in San Francisco in May of 1850. He wanted to get rich in the gold rush, but by the time he got here, the big opportunities were gone. Henry had friends and relatives in the Evergreen area of San Jose who had been here before the gold discovery. So he turned his eyes to the southern San Francisco Bay and the port of Alviso. His first job was on a steamboat that went from Alviso to San Francisco carrying passages and products from the Valley Farms. People traveled on the bay much more then than they do now because the roads weren't paved, think mud. And there were no bridges across the creeks. When we travel up 101 or El Camino today, we don't realize how many creeks we crossed that would have been a barrier to transportation in those days. This picture of the crossing of San Francisquito Creek is most likely the crossing at Middlefield Road. Henry soon quit his job on the steamboat and found work on a farm near his friends and relatives in the Evergreen area. This is not Henry in the picture, but represents a farm worker of the time. Providing food and supplies for the gold miners turned out to be a successful means of acquiring a fortune. There were many German families already settled in the Evergreen area, especially the Hostler family. More about them soon. This drawing of an Evergreen Avenue farm is from 1876. Henry began acquiring land of his own, eventually owning properties in Santa Clara County, in Evergreen, Milpitas, Mountain View, Los Altos, and in San Mateo County above Alpine Road. Mountain View and San Jose are shown by the black hexagrams. In Milpitas, he grew hay and grain. The Milpitas land consisted of 216 acres along Calero Creek and Penitencia Creek, with the land crossing the Oakland Road and the railroad. Coyote Creek was nearby. The next door neighbor was Matthew Dixon, who along with Captain Volpe later operated Dixon Landing for the scow schooners of the Milpitas area. If you've ever driven north on 880, you've passed the exit for Dixon Landing Road. It was a real place. In Los Altos, he grew fruit trees. The land was located along Adobe Creek, between Adobe and Giffen Road, which is now called San Antonio Road, between Portola and Pine and El Camino is right up here. In San Mateo, he raised cattle, logged redwoods, and mined some silver, all of which were sent to San Francisco for onward sale. 5 plots of lands in the hills along Alpine Road and Corte Madera Creek provided the fir and redwood that Henry used to build his home. Los Trancos Creek is the dividing line between Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. He was co-owner of a ranch on White Road in the Evergreen area near his wife's family. I understand that a member of the audience today is a descendant of Mr. Martin. This area is now an abandoned golf course. The school I taught in was here for many years, but I knew about the golf course, but I knew and didn't know that it had once been owned by Henry Rengstorff. In the shoreline area of Mountain View, Henry had several farms. In 1880, he reported crops of 800 bushels of barley, 2,400 bushels of wheat, and 174 tons of hay. These crops were grown without irrigation. Annual rainfall was adequate. On the farms, there were cows, horses, chickens, and pigs. 3 acres with 150 apple trees produced 900 bushels of apples. Notice there were no stone fruits, plums and such mentioned. The change in the Santa Clara Valley from wheat and barley production to stone fruits was just beginning in the late 1870s, early 1880s, facilitated by better drying and canning procedures, deep wells to provide irrigation, and better transportation, like railroads to get the fruit to market on the East Coast before it's spoiled. People are often surprised that wheat and barley was such a major crop in early times because we usually just think of all the pretty flowering fruit trees. Henry's Mountain View land consisted of 3 parcels between Stevens Creek and the old Permanente Creek bed. So 3 parcels here. Here he farmed. This is now Shoreline Boulevard. And here's Charleston Road. Still there today. In 1859, he built a landing on a branch of Stevens Creek. And the first Wisman School was located on Henry's land. There, at the end of the road to the bay, he built a warehouse and landing for ships coming from San Francisco. This picture is not Rengstorff family, haven't been able to find a good one, but is a landing in the North Bay at the same time period. Henry's Landing was known both as Rengstorff Landing and Mountain View Landing. This image, the only one that I found referencing it, describes the landing as being 2 miles from town, saying that the boat is ready to unload 80 tons of hay at Mountain View. Well, that description doesn't work for me, as they would, it says this boat is ready to unload 80 tons of hay. That description doesn't work for me, as they would have been unloading hay grown in the Mountain View area to take to San Francisco. By the way, hay has been called the gasoline of the time. It was the fuel that made your horses and oxen go. We have the original 1867 deed for the purchase of the parcels along Shoreline. This map from the Thompson and West 1876 Atlas shows Mountain View, downtown Mountain View, the star. This is actually New Mountain View at that time, and Stevens Creek, the blue line. Back then, the creek wandered through the marshland out to the bay. Today, the creek runs straight to the bay, and we still have marshland, but landfill has created the park at Shoreline, the golf course, and the amphitheater. More on that from Christina in a few minutes. Rengstorff Landing was located about where the entrance to the park is now. The house that Henry built was located on the road to the bay, later named Sterling Road, now Shoreline Boulevard. It has been moved twice, and more about that later. Notice long pointer. It can be used as a reference anytime you're looking at a map of the bay and you want to find Mountain View. Look toward the San Jose area, find that rounded point and look south and you'll see Mountain View. The house is now located about here. A warehouse at the landing was available to store the products from the local farms until a ship came to take them to San Francisco. In the late 1800s, Mountain View was a busy port with 3 landings: Rengstorff Landing, Guth Landing, and Jagel's Landing. Here's what Mr. Jagel's Landing looked like. It was first known as Bernard's Landing because the land was first owned by J. Bernard. And then Wisman's Landing. It was on the Wisman Slough, and Wisman Road would have ended here. And by 1903, the land was owned by John J. Jagels. All of these people are old Mountain View notable pioneers. San Francisco Bay from the 1850s to the early 1900s was filled with over 400 scow schooners. These flat-bottomed barges or scows with schooner rigging had a very shallow draft as the bay is not very deep. They could be heavily loaded with products from the nearby farms and ranches to take to San Francisco and return with supplies for the developing communities. The flat-bottom ships could come up into the shallow creeks, sloughs, and channels to the landings and rest on the bottom in low tide for easy unloading and loading. They were often homemade, cheap, and easy to build, just slapped together a bunch of boards. Here's a page from the ledger for Mountain View Landing from April 28, 1880. 2 of these scow schooners, the Nellie Rich and the Mountain View, regularly came to Mountain View Landing. Charles Sothman was the captain of the Mountain View. And this is the scow schooner Mountain View. In 1857, Henry married Christine Hassler, also from Germany. Her family lived in the Evergreen area of San Jose. They had 7 children and later 5 grandchildren. They led a busy life. You know, when kids come through on tours of Rengstorff House and they say they had 7 children, they're often amazed because our families today don't usually tend to that many children. The oldest child was Marie. She married Alfred Martel and had 2 sons, Robert and Alfred, known as Dutch. 23 days after the birth of son Dutch, Marie died, only 35 years old. As adults, her sons headed to the California gold country and other parts of the world to look for silver, gold, and quartz. Perhaps they'd heard their grandfather talking about his dream of gold. The oldest son was John, here shown with his dog, but he also cleaned up pretty good. John lived in Seattle, where he owned a shoe store. This is John to the left of the door. Here. The store burned in the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. The very next year, he rebuilt a handsome 4-story brick building on Pioneer Square known as the Rengstorff Building. It lasted until the 1930s. John later lived in Kiana, Alaska, where he was a district commissioner. He married twice, but had no children. Next came Elise Matilda. She attended Mills College in Oakland, receiving a degree in biology in 1883. At Mills, she became engaged to a young man, but just before the planned elaborate wedding, he drowned in an accident. Years later, back on the farm, her cousin Willie Hogg was working on the farm as an orchardist. He proposed, but she wasn't having it until one day in 1902, she went to the field and said, "Willie, if you want to marry me, get in the buckboard and we'll go to San Jose and do it." They were married for 43 years. They had no children. We'll meet Elise again later. Helena Margarita, called Lena, married a Mountain View doctor, Oliver P. Ascom from Ohio. Here's their Mountain View home. They had 2 sons, Earl and Perry, and that may be Earl and Perry here on the porch. They were 6 and 10 when their mother died in 1902 from tuberculosis. We'll hear more about them later, too. The house was in the 200 block of Hope Street on the west side, That would be across from where the post office is today. Christina Frederica, known as Nanny, married Robert McMillan, who came from a prominent real estate family in San Francisco. Their son Daniel was killed in an auto accident, pinned against a tree at age 21 while a law student at Berkeley. When Nanny died in 1945, her will directed that her whole $400,000 estate be used to erect an elaborate granite memorial gateway in Death Valley, remembering her son and husband. Deemed incompetent at the writing of the will was set aside and the money went to her sister, Elise. Henry Andrew ran the Mountain View Landing and became an active leader in Mountain View. His farm was located at the end of Calderon and Pastoria Avenues, which you see here, just south of the Charleston Road by Permanente Creek. Now, in earlier maps, Permanente Creek is actually shown over here labeled dry creek bed, but at some point the creek was actually diverted and sent up was what was called the ditch, but today that's the area where Permanente is. This area of the map is today about where the 101 interchange by Costco and Google are. Henry was on the board of trustees for the Wisman School, and his wife, Nellie Baker, was a Mountain View teacher. Henry died of a heart attack while driving. His wife averted a crash by turning off the ignition. At the time, he had been active in the grand jury investigations leading to the adoption of a report of the Morals Committee. It was deemed that his death would not affect that work. They had no children. The youngest child, little Charlie, died of scarlet fever at age 5. Henry and Christina and their children lived in a crowded small cabin until he built this house after purchasing the land in 1867. It was the first in the area to add indoor plumbing and electricity. Henry chose the Italianate Victorian style for his home. In California, the earliest Victorian residences were wooden versions of the Italianate style before later stick Eastlake and Queen Anne styles became popular. They had a low-hipped roof, eaves with corbels, pedimented and arch-headed windows and doors, and decorative coins on the corners. As we see our house, it has the low-hipped roof, the eaves with corbels, the pedimented and arch-headed windows and doors. Oops, not yet. And the coins on the corners. The result, one of the finest examples of Italianate Victorian architecture on the West Coast. Henry devoted his energies to managing the landing and the farms. So here's his farm, and do you see the house hidden among the trees here on the left? He was one of the foremost businessmen and philanthropists of this area of his day. He was known for loaning money to other farmers with just a handshake. In 1885, Henry received a patent for an excavator to remove dirt from dry creeks and form ditches and drains to improve irrigation. Henry was involved in Mountain View life. He was a member of the Republican Party and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. In 1859, he and one of his workers hauled the timber for this church building from the Lexington Mills in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This church stood at the corner of Castro and Church Streets, where Wells Fargo is today, until it burned in 1911. Henry and his family also participated in dramatic and musical performances in Mountain View. And in 1870, he sold for $1 a portion of his land to build the Wisman School. When Henry died of heart disease in 1906, the San Jose News reported him as one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the county. Only 3 of his children were still alive, 4 of them having predeceased him. Henry was buried in the Mountain View Cemetery, now Pioneer Park, as were other family members. The family plot was transferred to Oak Hill in San Jose in 1911. His wife, Christina, inherited his entire estate. He had trusted her to make provision for his surviving children and grandchildren. Christina and daughter Elise carried on the family business. In 1911, Elise and husband Willie moved from their home on San Antonio Road to live with and care for her elderly mother. After Christina's death in 1919, daughter Elise inherited the house and the surrounding property. Her siblings divided the money left to them. Elise and her husband, Willie Hogg, managed the farm, selling butter, eggs, and chickens to make ends meet. Here they are by their car at the side of the house. When daughter Lena, the wife of Mountain View physician Oliver Ascom, died in 1902, the younger son, Perry Ascom, was only 6. Here he is with his mother on the porch of their house in Mountain View. Do you see the tricycle? I looked at this picture for years before I saw it. It's over here on the left. Perry later came to live with his Aunt Elise and then his grandmother, spending many years of his youth in the Rengstorff House. Perry and his brother Earl were off to Europe several times, working with the American Field Service and the Red Cross during World War I. From the 1920s to the 1940s, Perry became well known as a light opera singer, appearing on stage and in many movies. Perry lived in Los Angeles, returning to Mountain View in 1945 to help run the Rengstorff farm after his Aunt Elise's husband, Willie, died. Here's Perry as the Red Shadow in one of his acclaimed roles, the stage musical, The Desert Song. His brother Earl also appeared in movies like the Flash Gordon series. In 1952, after the death of his Aunt Elise, the house went to Perry. As he aged, life as a rancher became more challenging. And in 1959, Perry sold the house to Newhall Land Development Company and moved to an apartment on Nob Hill in San Francisco, where he died in 1961 after returning home from a swim at the Olympic Club. Recently, the apartment where he lived was listed on Zillow, and I nagged a couple of pictures. Great views of Grace Cathedral and the Flood Mountain Mansion. Perry Ascom was the last family member to live in the house. That's the essential story of the Rengstorff family. And now I'll turn it over to Christina to tell you what happened to the house after that.
Well, thank you so much, Martha, for your generous amount of time and for the generous amount of time and talent you contributed toward today's presentation. I was especially inspired to learn of the dedicated work to expand our community's knowledge of the land that Henry Rengstorff once knew. We also look forward to hearing your recap of the story of the Friends of Our House toward the end of today's presentation. And so here we are, transformation of the North Bayshore area, saving, moving, and restoring the home. As I may have alluded to previously, this section spans several decades, 7 in fact, but it also includes a few historical flashbacks along the way. In case you hadn't already heard, prior to its development, Shoreline at Mountain View was a former hog farm, an auto wrecking yard, and a dump. In this slide, you can see an image of a 1955 flood, which caused severe flooding of regional farms, roads, and homes across California just prior to Christmas that same year. Inasmuch as that even today, flooding can occur in low-lying areas of the San Francisco Bay watershed, this significant flood was a strong signal to Mountain View officials that flood protection ought to become a priority in serious consideration of the benefit of health, safety, property value, and more. Fast forward to 1966, when the city and county of San Francisco joined forces with Mountain View to purchase much needed land for, when the city of Mountain View and county of Santa Clara joined forces to purchase much needed land for 1.1 million, a total purchase of approximately 600 acres of land for flood protection along the bay. I went forward too fast. In 1967, these same agencies agreed to establish what is now known as Shoreline Regional Park. And between the years 1970 to 1985, Shoreline became one of the first sanitary landfills in the country, having signed an agreement with City and County of San Francisco to accept the city's household waste. This effort significantly defrayed costs of fill material and would pave the way for transformation of the land. We'll remember my promise of flashback moments. Well, here you see the Rengstorff House as it still stood following Kerry and his wife Frances selling the house and farmland to Newhall Land and Development Company. We will share with you some other photos of just how downtrodden the house had become as we continue on with the story. But for now, just note that after being rented and suffering numerous fires, the house was in pretty bad shape, as seen here. In this slide, we take you on yet another flashback experience, an acknowledgement of the date 1965, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. This is a picture of the Guth family home. Martha mentioned him a little bit earlier. Who is Guth, you may ask? Well, if you take a look at the image of this image, you can see some of the areas where the scow schooners would have either stopped to pick up or deliver their wares. At the top of the screen, you can also see a close-up of the land grant plots previously occupied by Rengstorff and Guth. While Guth's property is not nearly as impressive as the Rengstorff house, in many respects, Guth, Jagels, and Rengstorff were all like-minded individuals of this bygone era. Just for interest's sake, we're also introducing you to another early land plot owned by John McNulty of Scotland. Here you can see Stevens Creek, which mirrors the more modern day map here. Elijah Stevens is a man who arrived in Cupertino just 2 years before the Donner Party's wagon train and 5 years before the 1848 to 1849 gold rush. Although McNulty, who I mentioned in the previous slide, owned the land further north along the creek, it was Elijah Stevens who got his namesake assigned to the waterway. Which brings us back to 1965. You see those dairy cows and the cowboy. This image was just a little too kind of cool that I couldn't resist including it. Suffice it to say, the land around this time was very, very different, and it was about to change quite dramatically. So here you see a conceptual drawing of the 1968 vision for Shoreline. This plan included a proposal which included sailboat areas, a marina, a major golf course, conference center, shoreline amphitheater, and intense recreational uses such as a swim facility, tennis courts, zoo, and community services building. In keeping with environmental goals, the city's 1968 plan did have an area that was devoted to meadowlands. However, as shown here, the plan was quite extensive in nature and was scaled back in the years that were to follow. Just around that time, in March of 1969, the Rengstorff House and Family Barn are still seen in their original location. It would not be until 1980 that the first Rengstorff House move would be completed. And I'd like to just take a moment to offer our thanks to Mountain View Historical Association member Eugene Sharp, who shared this image with us and who had the foresight of taking the picture back then from the TCI parking lot on Space Park Way. Here, circa 1970, is the city's planning director who had a vision for the entire North Bayshore area. Just as a special note, some years ago, Bob Lawrence hosted his granddaughter's wedding at the Rengstorff House. It was a pleasure to meet him, and we send our very best. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the name of Mountain View's former city manager, Kevin Dugan. Kevin ultimately supervised the majority of Shoreline's development, including land modifications that were the most active in this area, 1970 to 1995. Although the Mountain View Historical Association actually has many images taken by Kevin around this time, we did want to acknowledge the role that he played in Shoreline's development. And so with that, here are some of the earlier pictures of the dumping that occurred. As mentioned before, San Francisco's garbage was being transported to Mountain View on an ongoing basis for approximately 15 years. During this time, trucks would be placed on a piece of equipment called a tipper. And so during this time, more than 20,000 cubic yards of refuse were delivered to Mountain View in an effort to contour and raise the level of the land. During this time, the environmental movement was growing significantly. Here you see a picture of the Spencer family duck hunting trip circa 1930, but by the 1970s, new action was being taken to reclaim land from Leslie salt ponds, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's purchase of 13,000 acres of salt ponds throughout the South Bay. Now overseen by Don Edwards, SFA Wildlife Refuge, was supported the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project. This land is now adjacent to, but not officially operated by Shoreline nor the City of Mountain View. Salt ponds across the bay, yes, they do still exist. In fact, when you look down from an airplane, some of the reasons the varied color of the water is resulting from the changing salinity of the ponds around the bay. Meanwhile, back at Shoreline, waterfowl and wetland birds are happily at play, enjoying Charleston Slough, the sailing lake, and surrounding wetlands area. Special thanks to photographer Tiffany Wright for this beautiful shot. And so again, I bring you back to the landfill area, but this time with particular emphasis on the contour of the land behind the trucks and tippers. This photo provides a hint at just how the land was formed, in that the goal of the Shoreline Division and early landfill division was to create landfill cells, much like this. As shown in the diagram, a landfill cell is a little bit, I call it kind of like a large swimming pool with angled sides, surrounded by this thick layer of bay mud and clay. The garbage is poured in and is further compacted by the layering of what are called clay caps. Once completely full, then the landfill cell is topped off with its final layer of mud, clay, topsoil, and vegetation. And so essentially what the city had done is they raised the level of the land 20 feet, not only making a financially strategic decision to avoid the costly purchase of dirt, but this effort raised the level of the lowlands to a usable height and resulted in electricity cost savings, all the while providing an environmentally sound alternative to standard forms of electricity. Methane gas is the alternative energy I just spoke of. And so as the transformation of the land continued, here you can see what resulted: a complex system for gas capture, cleaning, and power generation. Pretty cool, huh? From refuse to resource, Shoreline has played an important role in providing alternative energy for the local community, and these activities continue even today. But I promised to talk about the house, right? So despite all of the trials and tribulations of the home, including, I alluded to the idea that there had been a house call for a fire, a burning mattress in the home in 1972. One city employee, Ken Alsman, along with his co-signers, took steps to place the historic home on the state and then the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. This meant that the U.S. Department of the Interior and the National Park Service had come forth to acknowledge the significance of the home. In 1979, longtime City of Mountain View volunteer and Mountain View school teacher Hazel Gibson was part of a group that put forth a recommendation to the city on behalf of the Shoreline Regional Park Committee. While you can see on the side Hazel's memory commemorated by the statement, "You have torn down every building in town from the earliest days. This is the only one left." Hazel is also part of a group that made a major revision to the 1968 conceptual plan for Shoreline. The recommendation was in keeping with the less formal bayside landscape, so as to provide recreational opportunities different from those found in other city parks. The committee brought forth the idea that the planned facilities be greatly reduced and that new emphasis be placed on preserving the natural features present. And so it was. We continued through time. That 1979 subcommittee report, and here in 1980, the House showing that it's getting ready and on the move for the first time. A condition of the National Register application was that the two-story building be moved out of a developing industrial area and flood basin, which helped the city's efforts toward that goal. Thanks to ABC Moving Company and initial recommendations from restoration architect Meinwieser and Associates, the House steered clear of light posts. It was lifted off of its foundation and was placed on a flatbed with 76 wheels to be moved, at least for the first time, approximately 1 mile. From 1737 Sterling Road, which is up toward the bottom, I can't see right here, to the orange spot, kind of sitting out in a field, the house moved and was at least clear of demolition for the time being. When Shoreline was finally dedicated to the public on July 17th, 1983, it offered an 18-hole golf course, a 50-acre saltwater sailing lake, 2 tidal marshes with boardwalks and observation platforms, turfed areas for picnicking, and miles of paths for jogging, bicycling, or strolling. And so just 18 years after the July 1965 memo, in which City Manager O'Halloran, right here, wrote in a memo that the proposed park in the North Bayshore location could be built on the sanitary landfill that is being developed on a part of this land at the present time, yet another civic vision was realized. Just as a fun fact, prior to Kevin Dugan's role as city manager, he worked for O'Halloran's office. At the time of Shoreline's opening, William Jelovich was mayor alongside the list of esteemed council colleagues shown here. And in 1983, 2 women named Jean Walker Wiley and Anne Laidley Snyder met and shared their mutual passion for the preservation of historic buildings. This was the meeting that resulted in a community group that would then move forward to encourage the continued restoration of the home. The groups called themselves the Friends of Our House and would morph into a more formal nonprofit immediately following the official dedication of the opening of the home. I guess you could say it was an exciting year for Shoreline because, again, in 1983, the Shoreline Sailing Lake and Cafe project was completed. And this was just 2 years before the end of dumping at Shoreline in 1985. Here you see a picture of concert promoter Bill Graham standing on land intended for a major concert venue in the land just adjacent to Shoreline. And in 1986, the concert venue opened its front doors to great acclaim. This slide requires almost no words, except that the concert venue was to a certain extent like none other. It's the tent, the raising of the tent. And thus a unique concert venue became a prominent recognized part of the North Bayshore landscape as shown here. As you might imagine, throughout this entire period, more habitat restoration was taking place, including efforts to support endangered species in the area. Although the location of the last photo is not confirmed, we suspect that they may have been planting pickleweed, which is the home of the salt marsh harvest mouse. And also here you see another endangered species that is known to live in the baylands around us. But let's not forget about the burrowing owls. As far back as the early 1980s, artificial burrows were being built to establish a prime breeding ground for the charming species of special concern. Other big projects were being developed, including the Tide Gate at Charleston Slough. And suffice to say, here are pictures of just a few of the individuals who played a major role in the development of Shoreline, the Rengstorff House restoration, and the features now present at Shoreline. We may not talk about each of them specifically, but amongst other key players, these individuals played a strong role in the development of Shoreline and the rest, as the rest of the Rengstorff story that is to come. So here we are. It was kind of a juncture. The house was sitting out in a field, and we've already made our first effort to save the home, but now what, right? As you may recall, the last time I talked about the house was in 1980, when it was moved out to an expansive location across from the golf course. It was left at, for some time until a more exhaustive plan could be developed. Suffice it to say, a lot was happening in terms of the land being developed. And also there were numerous schemes that were, we call them schemes, proposals, you might say, from community members who had ideas of what the house might become. Mountain View's Women's Club voiced support for the restoration of the home, while ultimately it is that group, the Friends of Our House, that continued to successfully advocate for full restoration of the building. We'll tell you more about the group as we continue on. Of course, there were various ideas that came forth. One was in 1972 when a Hillsborough couple offered to buy the house, cut it in half, and move it to Pescadero. Meanwhile, a group of De Anza college students had offered to had organized a Save the Rengstorff House campaign. And for better or worse, the effort to raise $65,000 and gain power of eminent domain was unsuccessful. Around that same time period in 1972, Newhall Land and Farming Company offered to restore and donate the house in exchange for a zoning break on a 300-acre parcel. This was rejected by the city and considered as a bribe. And in 1974, Santa Clara County Historical Heritage Committee proposed to save the house through use of a $250 million bond. That bond failed. 1 year later, in 1975, Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers were granted an option to purchase the house, albeit unsuccessful. Through all of this, as you can imagine, the house was sitting somewhat dilapidated along Sterling Road at first. And as you can see, it had eventually moved out to the field. It sat and it sat. But the road at Shoreline was getting ready for the next transition, because on May 8th of 1986, the house was moved to its final location nearly 2 years before the request of $1.17 million. Once the house was ready for its second move, City of Mountain View staff knew that the biggest challenge would be to get it over the concrete culvert bridge alongside Permanente Creek. Engineers calculated the weight of the house and compared it with the bridge's capacity. Finally lifted onto a transporter with 76 wheels, the house rounded the curve and was successful, went over the bridge and was successful in reaching its final destination. So I showed you the map earlier of the house. We didn't get a chance to remove this dot, but the house sat out in the field and then continued along down the road. 1986 is when this move was completed. If you were to have a chance to talk to Mark directly, which could be possible, he would undoubtedly say that one of the most crucial decisions related to the restoration of the Rengstorff House was a decision to install a rigid grid foundation prior to even the first move of the house. Alongside this, the second most important decision was to secure the house to the foundation, done during restoration, ensuring that every portion of the house was properly supported, including seismic loading. The rigid grid is a reinforced concrete grid rather than perimeter footing or pier footing. And since the house was on engineered fill, subject to deferential settlement, a rigid grid system was far superior to a perimeter or pier footing. It could distribute the load and allow for re-leveling as necessary. Here are just some of the historical documents related to structural calculations, the seal of completion, I believe, of that process, dated down here, December 31st of 1989. If you ask longtime staff member and Friends of Our House member Ginny Kaminsky about her greatest love associated with the Rengstorff House restoration, it would likely relate to the genealogy and the stories that brought the home to life. Here you see in the last slide and in this slide, you see Ginny with former Friends of Our House board member Mary Boudrias. Both were part of the team that uncovered the family's connection to the Dave Brubeck family. And on June 8, 1986, widow Frances Askham visited the site along with her longtime friend. Imagine the emotional experience this would have been, remembering not only her husband, Harry Askham, and his family, but the time spent living in the home nearly 30 years prior. Glenn Lyles is shown here surveying the site, and he's talking to Frances about her memories, which would ultimately inform interpretation of the site. In order to do the restoration project due diligence, the city and key players would need to know how the house had been used, and especially given the major damage that you can see here. In some cases, changes to the structure would need to be made. For example, here you see the enclosed patio that was used by the family during the time they lived there. Well, this was the interpretation that staff made, not to mention the fact that this is a silly group that was getting married here. Also, actual use of the various rooms would need to be considered, and more elegant details reimagined. Frances is known to have applied wallpaper to some of the walls during her time living in the home, and yet some of the patterns are reminiscent of the famous designer William Morris, who is shown here. Morris was most known for his work alongside the British arts and crafts movement, and many of the wallpapers are currently in the house are chosen reminiscent of his work. In January of 1987, some people may have taken a sigh of relief when, as you can see in the top left corner, it says hostel out of mansion. The Council of the American Youth Council had withdrawn its proposal to restore and turn the home into a hostel. This was especially given Shoreline Amphitheater is nearby. One might imagine the potential for that project had it come to fruition. And meanwhile, members of the Friends of Our House, the group I mentioned earlier, were ongoing and dedicated in their approach. This early member, Dick Weir, is credited for producing the buttons that were handed out to members of the public showing their support of funding that would be needed to restore the house by the city of Mountain View. The meeting would take place on March 1st of 1998 and included the grounds layout, but also set the plan forward to work with Page, Anderson, and Turnbull architects and Maida and Jensen general contractors. And in this artwork created by Michelle Roberts, this piece of artwork is perhaps a critical piece of the meeting that occurred that evening. In order to get support behind the project, this black and white drawing showed the potential for the home and how it would be used. In particular, the upstairs area would serve as much needed Shoreline Division offices. The downstairs would be the historic home. And then outdoors, the garden area would be available for public use, also generating much needed revenue via a community rentals program. And so finally, between the spring of 1988 and the end of 1990, the house underwent its transformation. Mark Rogie served as shoreline engineer 1983 to 2000. He was key to the work with Meinwieser and Associates of San Jose to build the foundation and bring the utilities up, as I already mentioned. Later, he played an important role in the work with Maida and Jensen to ensure that no detail would be overlooked. Kathy Sterla was the person responsible for day-to-day activities on site, and surely Mark would have recognized so many others who worked on the team. But still, some of the major decisions related to the exterior portions of the home, the newel post design, the paint colors, wallpaper choices, and installation were partly his. Here Rogie stands alongside members of the contracting team, as they all had signed a supporting board as a symbol of their shared pride in the Restoration House project. There really isn't time to acknowledge all of the individuals, professionals, and civic leaders that played a part in the development of Shoreline and Mountain View, in particular the Rengstorff House, but we attempted to capture some of the key players here. Maybe some of you were part of it. I also saw that we may have someone who lived in the home during the time it was a rental unit with us today. So in reality, it is said that the Shoreline team was close-knit, dedicated, and committed to the integrity of their work. And so, as you decide to visit Shoreline in the future, to run, walk, bike, connect with nature, enjoy the sailing lake, Michael's at Shoreline, and the Robert Trent Jones Jr. Design Golf Course. We hope that you'll appreciate all that goes into understanding the lay of the land, not to mention the wildlife activities throughout the South Bay. Because Shoreline continues to strive for stability and even growth of wildlife and other species of concern, including the burrowing owl. The 750 acres of land is a hot spot for protected species, and you can see that our staff is keeping track. Shoreline is now a habitat for birds and wildlife, not to mention a place where even today, city staff and community leaders pay attention to the potential for sea level rise and its impact on our communities. We join with community members and users of Shoreline, as well as the entire Mountain View Trail system, to celebrate the role of alternative forms of public transportation now into the future. From refuse to resource, and from fine home to farm and farmhouse to a source of Mountain View's collective memory and our future lives together, we thank you for your interest. And with that said, the story is not over. There's, if you can imagine, so much happened inside of the house. And as we promised, we were going to talk a little bit more about the role that the Friends of Our House played. So I'm going to, let's see, how am I going to unshare? I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to stop this video and hand it over to Martha again.
I have a quick review of the things that happened after the house was moved and refitted. Christina's told you about the purchase by the city and the move. And in 1991, the newly incorporated nonprofit Friends of Our House undertook to return the interior of the house to its original grandeur, working to decorate and furnish it as it might have looked in Henry's time. The visit by Perry Ascom's wife, Frances, who brought pictures and told stories, helped make selections during the restoration. The tatters of 1940s wallpaper were archived, and a company in Benicia, Bradbury and Bradbury, which specializes in period wallpaper, was chosen to supply the beautiful wallpapers. So the wallpaper in the house today is not the original wallpaper, but a reproduction of the type of wallpaper from that time. Let's take a quick tour of the house today, beginning with the dining room. It's a sizable room with 2 large tables. The wooden mantle was reconstructed using old pictures. You can just see the form of the mantle here in this picture of Henry's wife, Christina. This room was Henry's office. This is the only room which had a black marble mantle. That's the kind of thing we would have learned from Perry's wife or others who had visited the home in its heydays. Here we see the family parlor, our library. The furniture in this house is furniture from the period, except for these 2 chairs in the library, which are from the Rengstorff family. The mantles in the house had all disappeared during the years the house was vacant, so similar mantles were chosen to replace them. Notice this picture over the mantle. This is Perry Ascom, the last owner, standing by the original marble mantle in the library. Here we have the formal parlor where important guests were received. The paintings over the sofa were the work of son John. And here's what it looked like when decorated for the 1889 wedding of Lena, Perry's mother. One room was dedicated to music, where today we have a working Victrola, a piano, and an Edison player to provide music. The painting is of Perry Ascom, and when you visit, you can hear him sing on our boombox. The doors were open to the public 30 years ago on March 2nd, 1991. Maybe you're in this crowd. In the years after that, further enhancements were added to the house and grounds. In 2005, a tank house was built and dedicated to replicate the one that Henry had, thanks to work from architect Henry Woods. It's currently used for storage. And here we see Mary Lentz, who was the head of the committee that put this together. When the pumpkin patch on Grant Road closed down in 2007, Dave Schmitz donated the windmill, which had once pumped water on the Chavis farm across from Henry's house. The windmill was then installed and dedicated next to the Rengstorff House at its new location. Again, thanks to work from Henry Woods. And here is Charles Grant, who was the head of the committee that put that project together. The Friends of Our House have worked together through the years to continue the mission of telling the story of Henry, his family, and his house, and keeping alive this part of the history of Mountain View. You may remember some events from the past: holiday open houses, music in the garden, or living history days. Students from Mountain View schools come on field trips to learn about local history. We have visitors from all over the world, and we have local people who say, "I've lived here many years and never got around to visiting the house." Today, the house is used for 3 purposes. Upstairs are the offices for Shoreline. We don't take tours up there. You've all seen desks and computers. The configuration of the rooms upstairs is the same, essentially the same as downstairs, and that's where the bedrooms were. The house can be rented for weddings and special events, and the house is a museum. Are you interested in early Mountain View history? Do you enjoy interacting with people of all ages and background? Maybe this is for you. We have openings for docents to help share the story with visitors to the house. Training and flexible scheduling opportunities are available. Just contact Christina for more information. And for the future, the pandemic has changed things. The house is closed. We're endeavoring to share the stories of Henry and Shoreline through changing methods of communication. Currently, the Friends are working in collaboration with the city to launch a 3D virtual tour, which will enable you to walk around inside the house and look at all that's there online. The Friends of Our House is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our missions are sharing the story of the house and family as part of the history of Mountain View and managing and conserving our museum collection. We invite you to become a member to help further these missions. Until the house is open again, you can visit us on our website or Facebook to see videos and more. And as soon as the house is open again, we hope you will come by and see us. Thanks to all of you for coming to hear our stories. And now let's hear from the panel and learn about any questions you have from the audience.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. That was just so interesting, and a lot of research went into both of the presentations, and we thank Christina and Martha for their efforts. So we do have a couple of more people who may participate in our Q&A session, which will start in just a moment. Jean Walker Wiley, Christina spoke a little bit about her, that she was one of the powerful duo who started the idea of saving the Rengstorff House. We also will be joined by Mark Roge, who was as a professional civil engineer and has worked for several cities and did work for the city of Mountain View for a number of years and was helpful in getting the house moved. And then lastly, we have Jenny Kaminsky, who is a Shoreline volunteer coordinator and longtime member of Friends of Our House. She worked for the city of Mountain View for over 20 years and retired in 2003. She's one of the first docents for Deer Hollow Farm, which is another story. But in any case, she has worked to manage some of the programs for volunteers at Shoreline and the Rengstorff House. And lastly, if she chooses to participate, we just found out that a former resident of the house, Judith Rizzio, who lived there in the 1960s, is listening today. So if she would like to make any comments too, that would be great. So we have a number of questions that were suggested to us. Oh, and also Ken Altman, I think Christina also made mention that he might be listening and joining us as well. So Christina suggested a number of questions, but perhaps we will start with the questions that were in the Q&A. One of them was from Jamil Sheikh, who wants to know, when was the last day of public landfill activity? Christina, do you know the answer to that?
I am so sorry. I do not know the answer to that question.
I'm sorry, this wasn't meant to be a trick. Gotcha.
Yeah. Certainly. Hey, Nick, your video just came up. Does that mean you know?
I don't, but I was wondering if the panel wanted me to add the other folks in right now or wait until after you answer the first questions.
I was wondering about that. I think now would be a great time since we
All
just
right.
One of them might know the answer. So yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I will. I'll start doing that right now, folks. So get your cameras ready, and I will be
So
ready.
in the meantime, while I was doing that, the other question that we had was from Robert Cox, who is our vice president. Are there any known descendants of Henry and Christina living in the Bay Area or elsewhere?
I can deal with that. You may have noticed as I talked about the 7 kids that many of them had no children or their children died young. There are actually maybe 4 grandchildren that went on to be people, and they didn't necessarily all have children either. We do know of some descendants of Perry's brother Earl. We've met one of them who lives in San Diego, and she has a brother who lives in Seattle. And that's sort of it. There were 2 boys, if you remember, who went off around the world looking for gold and stuff. And we've sort of lost track of them. One of them we don't think had children. But anyway, we've met one person from San Diego. There were a lot of other Rengstorffs in the Bay Area. They weren't descendants. They were relatives of Henry or his wife. And those people are abundant.
Mark, you're muted. Mark, you're muted.
Still muted.
Mark, do you want to say something?
There we go.
Guess not. Okay, and we have Jean Walker Wiley has joined, and Jenny has joined. Maybe she wants to put her video on. So that's interesting that out of 7 children, there aren't that many descendants, because with very large families, sometimes you get a couple generations later, tens or maybe hundreds of people. So that's interesting. So the other question that we had was, when was the last date of active dumping activity? Mark, do you know that one?
The problem is they declared the last day of the dumping activity about 5 different times, and there were different events to declare that, and then they decided they wanted a little more money. So I think the actual last date was pretty far along, certainly, in the 1990s. Yeah,
and then Mountain View was not the only city along the bay that had significant dump facilities. City of San Mateo has a huge hill that they built out of their landfill. So it was not uncommon to have these major dump facilities along the bay.
And there was a big push at the time. They wanted to open up the rest of what we at the time called Farmers Field, and that whole area where the Googleplex is, because that was originally shoreline property that was intended for the landfill. But when they were pushing to expand the landfill, and obviously the landfill operators and the people that were going to make a lot of money off of running the landfill wanted to push for it really heavily, we came on the other side and said the land now is far too valuable. And with all of the improvements out at Shoreline, the Shoreline area that led into the district and the tax increment money, that was much better, better use of the land as development for other things like the high-tech stuff rather than the landfill. So at the time, that was then leased to SGI, who was a big player in the area, Silicon Graphics. And they're the ones that opened up that building that we now know as the Googleplex. And later, SGI kind of waned a little bit, and they ended up selling that over to Google. But the city at that time still owned the property and was leasing it out. But we were leasing it out at far more money than we could have made on the landfill at that point.
Interesting. So one other question that we have is, again, from Robert Cox. Did Henry Rengstorff have other mansions or residences, or was the Rengstorff house his primary residence?
Jenny, do you want to say anything about that?
As far as we know, the Rengstorff house was his primary resident, and I don't know of any other homes that he had built except for the son on the other piece of property in Mountain View.
Okay, so so some of the questions that were suggested earlier, I'll ask this of the Friends of Rengstorff House people. What was the most exciting thing or the most interesting thing that you found about the history of the house or the family?
Jenny, you did a lot of the early research, so what do you think was the most interesting?
Oh boy. I have to think on that a minute. There were just so many things that happened along the way. And it was just a pleasure to work on it and to do the research. It just was one of the highlights of my career. I can't think of any one thing that I discovered along the way, but it sure was a fun project.
One thing I'm finding is that with so much more becoming available through the internet, I'm making new discoveries all the time. Like that picture I showed you of John in front of his shoe store in Seattle. I discovered that yesterday. And, I knew that he had a business in Seattle and I knew about the big building on Pioneer Square, but that other one just added a whole new layer of things. So I think the ongoing discoveries that keep turning up and then the connections that are made, oh, that person lived next door to that person. And, it's a continuing journey.
Christine asked me to talk about the ledger, which was one of the interesting things that was kind of amazing find that we found during the restoration. So you have to imagine somebody had put this register away up in the eaves of the building. And even though it sat there and it was rented out for years and it was, vandalized for years, and then it was moved and up on cribbing for years, and then it was moved a second time. And as we went into it, there was certain little areas, particularly near the rear staircase, which at one time was a winding staircase. And there were boxes within boxes in that. And we really thought we were going to uncover something special in there, because we did find some trick boxes in there, but there was nothing in there. But then as we were, cleaning it out and kind of removing all of the detritus, one of the workers reached in and found this in the eaves in a very tight little space, and found this book. And he brought it to me and asked me if I wanted to keep it. And I said, oh yeah, this is something kind of important. And it was really interesting reading through that book to see kind of some of the transactions, some of the dollar figures that are in there, some of the mores of the time where gave this worker a pair of gloves, charged him $1.50. He was late the next day and docked him $2, or things along those lines that are really revealing. But it also really reveals a lot of the shipping on the Rengstorff Landing, which was really great. And by the way, I wanted to Martha presentation was wonderful. And I know that's been backed up with a lot of research from Ginny and others on the family. My main interest is just the architecture of the house. And if you're interested at some point, I would be happy to do a tour of the house with the architecture, because there's a lot of hidden architecture in the house. There's a lot of very significant things about the house that really do make it a perfect example of Italianate Victorian architecture. It is quite stunning, even from the structural wood that's used that runs the full length of the house. Every beam in the walls runs the full 2 stories, and every floor joist runs the full length of the house from side to side. You can't even get lumber like that anymore. And the lumber that was used is extremely dense first growth Doug fir. And then all of the cladding on the outside is redwood. And it's just when the guys were working on it, and Maiden Jensen was really a cabinetry firm that had expanded into other things, and they loved wood. And the guys that worked on it were so thrilled when they were revealing the wood that was left behind, and just marveled at it. So we did leave those 2 panels in the front hallway so you could open those up and see the original Doug fir studs and the cladding.
A couple questions for you. So Mark, are you saying it was balloon framing?
The entire thing is balloon framed. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
for those who don't know balloon framing, it means that there isn't an intermediate floor joist like we have now, where the 8-foot ceiling and then there's framing around and then more building on top. These go floored all the way up to the roof line. Well, so why do you think somebody hid a ledger up there? Did they?
I don't know if it was hidden or if it was just, a place to put it where, people wouldn't get at it. It maybe was just a good.
I remember where I put that, right?
And it was so secure that nobody found it for, that had to be some, 40 years or more that people didn't find that thing. And it was just remarkable that it remained. I think one of the other really remarkable things, at least for me, was, now you have a lot of pictures and a lot of history and a lot more information about the house. When we started the restoration, we had very little. And we appealed to the Historical Society to try to get us more pictures. And we really still didn't get very many of them. And we hired really great architects. They're restoration architects that are rather famous, Page and Turnbull. So we were relying on them, and they were taking their best guesses of what things were. And of course, there was some scars of remaining things that were out there that were good. But one day we were out there and two young men came up to the construction site. They were very nervous. They were very frightened. And they said, well, we have some pieces of the Rengstorff House and we want to give them to you. And we want you to know we didn't steal them. We tried to restore them. We tried to save them from being pilfered because everybody was going to the house. Every time there was a story about the house, people would go out and rip off more of the, ornamentation of the house. So they took one example of every baluster in the house, which was amazing because while we had one example of a pilaster lamp finial that we were able to use to recreate all of the lamp finials in the house, we didn't have any of the actual balusters. And it turns out there were 3 different types. Now, since we didn't have real ones, we were just going to grab something that was commercially available. That was our best guess of it based on the photographs of what we could see. But now that we had the actual samples from these 2 young men, we actually took those samples and sent them out and had them all turned using those samples. So every baluster that is on the house, and there's 3 different types. The first floor level are the funerary type balusters. And then the top balusters on the Widow's Walk are called heiresses that are kind of heaven looking. And then the middle balusters that are on the balcony are a combination of the 2. So it's a transition of the 2. And that was very important if you read a lot of the books of the era, that talked about as you enter the building, you are giving reverence to generations past, the funerary balusters. And then the top floor is looking at the future of where we might be. And the middle floor is talking about our plane on Earth currently. So it was very symbolic and really important to the house. So the architects were thrilled at finding these, and we were thrilled at getting them. That was one of the change orders we made, is to have those balusters made up. But it really made a huge difference in the house. So here's how 2 young men, and they also brought us drawings that they had made of the house as a class project. So they were very significant.
So Mark, I'm going
The other
to
thing I want, a quick shout out.
I'm really excited about that, and so am I. The architecture sounds so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to make sure that we give Judith a chance to talk, and Jean. So one of the questions that we had, we'll go with Judith first. Just a few of your recollections of what it was like to live there, and then Jean, maybe you can tell us about some of the other early members of Rengstorff House and how you guys dreamed up the idea of Friends of Our House. So we'll have Judith go first.
Hello, this is a real thrill for me because this kind of just fell in my lap off of the Facebook page I joined to be informed of what happens around Mountain View. And I found out maybe 5 years ago that the was into this civic center recreational area from my girlfriend who still lived in California. When I did house, I remember it was in its original site, and we drove, the driveway drove on the side of the house, and then I think there was a what kind of tree? Palm tree was also on the side, and there was a porch. And we always entered the house through the porch and then entered into the formal room. And I remember that it had 5 marble fireplaces. And the kitchen did not have any cabinets like to hold dishes, because it had its own food pantry for dry goods and things like that. And in that pantry, there was a staircase that went upstairs into the maid's quarters, and that was where my grandmother lived, upstairs in the maid's quarters, which she had a living room and a bathroom, maybe a bedroom if I could remember. And downstairs, after you enter the dining room, you took a left turn in the hallway. To the right was a room with another fireplace, a marble fireplace that butted up against the next room, which was the main living room. So on each side of the wall, there were marble fireplaces. And that was the main room. And when you left that, you came to the front door. So across the hall was another room with another fireplace and one on the other side of that. And my uncle and his new bride lived there. So we had 3 families living in the house. The telephone company in Mountain View allowed my mother to put in a payphone. So I thought that was really cool, only being in, junior high, to have a payphone in my house. What else could I remember? I remember there was a water holding facility outside back of the house, and my brother and his friends would swim in that on hot summer nights. And there was a barn in the back, and that was a big thing to have that barn, because they were into cars and things like that. And I think there was also in the back of the house, I don't know how far, was another house structure. It might have been for migrant workers or something like that. But everything in the front of the house and facing the house to the left was all like agriculture. And then on down the road was the Westman Elementary School. So that's what I remember about the house that I lived in. And this basement house, the room to the right, on the upper level, was my bedroom. So I remember at that time, in the 60s, they were building the drive-in theater. I think it was called Moffat Drive-In Theater. And I remember that I could go out on the balcony with my girlfriend and we could watch the movie. We just couldn't hear it. And so that was kind of exciting. And that's kind of my childhood memories from Rengstorff House, which I didn't even know it had a name. My mother rented that mansion for $125 a month. My father was in the Navy and stationed at Moffat Air Station, but he was overseas in Okinawa. So, my mother was, you might say, a single mom. And so when she got a chance to rent it, up until then we lived on Joaquin Road, which was another memory from your slides, because you showed the dump back there. And I remember that we lived on, it was a dirt road. It was a bumpy road that led to the dump. And we talked about dairy farms, and behind our house on Joaquin Road was a dairy, I remember. So
Great. So thank you so much. I'm gonna cut you off, Judith, as we're running over time, and I wanted to make sure that we had time.
That's fine.
To speak. So perhaps, Judith, you can mute yourself now, and let's have Jean tell a little bit about how you guys, I shouldn't say guys, how people dreamed up this wonderful idea.
Hi, thank you so much for all the amazing story of Rengstorff House as it's unfolded. This, Christina and Jenny, and done so much work. Mark for putting it together. Martha, what a wonderful history that you provided. What a great teacher you are with all of this. I so appreciate it. Originally, as a young, I was an immigrant essentially to California from Utah. So seeing that the house was just sitting there on top of blocks, it was just like, oh, it's time to go and find out what is going on with that. It was like an amazing just to see it sit there. Something had to happen. So a friend of mine, a new friend of mine that became a lifelong friend, Ann Schneider, I mentioned it to her and we're like, okay, well, let's go find out about that. And, we're called the City of Mountain View, and Ken Alsman was, one of the first contacts, and Glenn Lyles. And we decided that what would be helpful would be to have some advocacy to see if it could be restored. And one of the many uses was to, have offices there for the city. And also to all the things that have come up, the weddings, having it be a historical house, the historical reuses being the teas and the weddings and the events and the art fairs. All of those things were things that the group from the community suggested. And these were meetings that we asked people to come and join and come to the library and meet there. And then we were petitioning the city council to take action on this and make it a reality. So it was a big project, lots of money, lots of things that had to happen, and a lot of players. So I'm appreciative of all of you and many people that were early volunteers. People like Dick Weir and the Lace Museum, people that have come and gone. And I actually live in Virginia now. So my family restored a house in San Jose, and then we ended up moving to Virginia. So we're so appreciative of all the workers that have come and before us, and we're hoping that others will continue, and especially to have the
A question from the audience is, why do you feel your organization was able to be successful when sadly many times a community can't be put together to save historic buildings?
In the end, I think it was stick-to-itiveness and continuous pursuit of going to the city and getting some inside help of all the city council and the people that wanted to see it restored. So we're grateful for that, and so happy that it was saved. The only historic home in Mountain View, essentially, oldest. So grateful that it's there.
Great. I'm sorry, we're going to kind of keep people's answers short. So one question that we had from Lisa Matichek was, what were the biggest challenges in trying to figure out how to move the house? And did somebody say this is a crazy idea, the thing's going to fall off the railings because the building is so decrepit? Mark, maybe you could answer that, or
I can give it. I don't know a lot about the first move of the house. But I can tell you one of the things was because of that balloon framing, I think it helped keep the house together. But before the house was moved, a lot of cross bracing was added to the house. So a structural analysis of it was done first to see how it could be supported. The one thing that may be kind of interesting, the house at its original location did not have a foundation. It only had a mud sill. So it had a redwood mud sill around the perimeter, and that's all there was to it. The only foundation that existed were the foundations for the fireplaces. And so the first move, that would have been the big challenge. Now they had already taken away all of the mantelpieces, the marble mantelpieces, but there had to be fire brick behind that. And that fire brick had to be demoed, to move the house. But other than those foundations, there was virtually nothing else left because it just had this mud sill. And we've kind of represented the mud sill on the house, even though now it's on a regular foundation. It would never survive on a mud sill foundation on engineered fill. So we had to put in a real foundation.
Do you think the fact that it was on a mud sill and not bolted to a cement foundation made it easier initially to move the building?
Yeah, I think it did make it easier initially. It may have also, interestingly enough, it may have also protected it from earthquakes because it could slide around a little bit. So there's a type of foundation that's designed that way to survive earthquakes. So that may have helped preserve the house initially. Now it has a seismic foundation and it has seismic structural integrity, but it may not have originally had that.
Interesting. Does anyone know when the house was first rented, or the time in which it was rented to the time it was abandoned?
Was probably after Perry left in 59. Then it was rented, I think from then on until it was in too bad a condition to be rented.
There's also urban legend that the motorcycles were roared up and down the staircase. Is that a urban legend, or was there some basis in that reality?
That's true.
True.
We had people stop by and tell us that that's what they used to do.
And I always thought Ginny may have been one of them.
The manager for the land company lived there for just a bit, and then they, right after it was bought, and then they rented, and I always understood it was for about 10 years, and then that would take us to a later time when it then was abandoned. I do want to mention a book. You see me holding out. This is a book written by Jenny Kaminsky, and it is available at Rengstorff House, which is closed now. We don't have it on the internet at Amazon or anything, but if you were to go to our website and send us a note, I'm sure we could manage to get a few out of the house and send them to you. It was sort of my Bible in learning how to be a docent and to do backup for a lot of the presentations that I do about the house. So good
And
idea.
also a plug for your website. There's a wonderful presentation about the 30 years of Rengstorff's house. It sort of images moving around. It's really fun. It's not just a static flat screen thing where you just read and read and read, but it's a very, very nicely done. So make sure you go to Friends of Our House and look at that wonderful presentation on 30 years.
And that's partly Christina's work too. So
well, it's a wonderful
thing,
presentation. I was very impressed with it.
We welcome for you to join us on Facebook, of course, and we'll be continuing to release stories beyond today's presentation and recognition of essentially the 30th year. So
yes, make sure you go to the website because
more to come.
There was a question.
Did a great job. Thanks. Go ahead, Mark.
There was a question asked about, was there anything else moved with the house, such as vegetation or anything like that? And no, there wasn't. But I think it is significant to note that we hired a restoration landscape architect to look at old aerial photographs and to look at old pictures of the house, so that the gardens around the house are actually a recreation of what we believe was originally there. And there's certain things that were significant, plantings. One of them is the pepper trees that are in that little roundabout in the entryway. Those pepper trees, there was a pepper tree that was at the original house location. And I don't think the pepper tree is there any longer, but I know Ken Alsman required, when they built that tilt-up building, there's kind of a big dent in the building that went around that pepper tree because it was considered historic, because it showed the relationship between where the house originally stood. So that's why we put those pepper trees in that location and a lot of the other planting in there. We obviously made some adjustments to make the garden a little more grand. It was designed for a large wedding tent to go into the turf area on the one side. And then on the other side, it was designed to act as a chuppah for weddings and that sort of thing. So some of the consideration that was adjusted was made so that we knew that the Rengstorff house had to be economically feasible into the future, so that it wouldn't be a burden. Instead, it would be a big plus. And so having it be allowed to make money was important, which is one of the reasons we also expanded the dining room, where there was a screened terrace on one side. We pushed the dining room out so that it would be economically viable. But we did leave a scar there so you can see where the wall was moved out.
So
Magnolia,
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Jenny was mentioning the magnolia trees. I think they used to talk about going out there with a shotgun and shooting off the magnolia blossoms and putting them in the house. So that's why the house is flanked with the magnolia trees. And so a lot of the things. And then there was also a wonderful woman, I can't think of her name right now, who was a rosarian, or you know, she was big with roses.
Barbara Gordon.
Barbara
She's
Gordon.
still very
She
active.
helped lay out the rose garden portion. But the other thing that was significant, I don't know if it still remains true today, but we did not put any species of plant in the house that didn't exist prior to 1867. That was one of the goals. And in fact, there was one rose that was the first hybrid tea rose that was designed in 1867. And so that one rose was put into the garden at one point. But you know, we didn't want to have any later varieties of plants or cultivars of plants after 1867.
Elise was a botanist, and people would come by and admire the grounds and say it looked like a little Garden of Eden. She always got compliments on the gardens. They were beautiful.
And did she have to irrigate that during the summer? Or how does she have her roses watered?
I don't think they had irrigation.
Well, I can tell you something about the water at the house. Originally, there was no windmill, but there was a water tank. And so that seems incongruous. And there's a really good reason for that, is because if you are far enough south or far enough north in Mountain View, close enough to the bay, the wells are what we call, I can't think of the word, they're artesian, which means that if you drill a hole into the ground, into the aquifer, the water pressure in the aquifer will push the water right out of the well, and it'll run up to the elevation of the aquifer that runs up to the hillside. So there was no need to pump water. There was no need to have a windmill, but there was a need to store the water because it didn't come out at the velocity that you would want it to come out for your use. So what you would do is you'd take this artesian well and let it fill your tank. And after it filled the tank, it would have a valve on it that would either close it off or it would run the water out to the fields to irrigate the fields. So that could happen automatically. So they were not needing for any water out there. They could control the water pretty much as they wanted to, until much later years when we started overdrafting the aquifers, and then the aquifers were no longer artesian in that area. But even in 1983, there were still artesian wells out at Shoreline. We had a big problem with them because capping them was a major concern when we started having groundwater contamination in the area, because they would allow the groundwater contamination to move between aquifers. So all of those wells had to be destroyed starting in 1982.
Interesting. So we have a few more questions. This has gone to a wonderful discussion. I am so excited. We still have 36 people who are interested to learn more. So I guess we'll go for a few more minutes. There's a question from Karen McGow. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. There's sort of a dark side to the Rengstorff story, and that's the connection between 1976 Chowchilla kidnapping of the children and the house. Does anybody want to address that question?
I will, because when I first started, there were letters from the kidnappers saying that they were aware of parts of the house were. I actually went to Soledad Prison to interview Fred Woods, and it was very interesting. But they wanted to purchase the house and restore it. And they wanted a piece of property in Mountain View. And I think that's where the whole, it all fell through at that point. It was more money than they were willing to pay.
It's an interesting parallel because I wrote a essay at the time about two young men who went about preserving the house in the wrong manner, and two young men that went around about preserving the house in the right manner, and compared those two. Because I was the one, I had happened to have my name in the newspaper because I was out at the Rengstorff House and I was starting the restoration. So they took a photograph of me and the Rengstorff House. And apparently these boys saw my name. So the letter was sent to me. So I'm at work and I get this letter from Soledad Prison. And I think Glenn was kind of chiding me. Well, who do you know in prison? And I had no idea what this was. I thought it was a joke because Glenn was pretty good at jokes. And we opened the thing up and here is this letter saying that they have the original mantelpieces and we could get them for some cooperation that they wanted us to do.
They wanted us to get them out of prison so they could restore the house. And Glenn said, no way.
Well, actually, you know, Shelley Emerson was our attorney at the time. And she looked at the letter, and we consulted with her and she said, you don't want any part of this. But, you know, they wanted to talk to somebody. Ginny was chosen. Ginny went down to the prison and that was quite an experience. Later on, I got a nasty-gram from them that they were upset that they thought I was too good to come down and talk to them. And that I, you know, that they felt I had disrespected them in some regard or something. But it was just a matter of Ginny was a lot better at dealing with all of those kinds of things and was perfect to go down there and talk to them. And in any event, it was not fruitful. We did not receive anything from that family.
They didn't really give us any more information that we didn't already know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they clearly had a desire of the house. They liked the house and they wanted to, I think they were talking about turning it into a film studio and other things. But you can look in the record and they did address the city council. They went to the city council and asked the city council for money and for property. But the city council was not about to give two guys money and property to restore this house, because even though a lot of people love the Rengstorff House now, at that point, Ken Alsman early on was the only person that was really pushing to save the Rengstorff House. And he's the one that got it put on the register. And he's the one that finally got it saved from the wrecking ball and got it moved out to Shoreline. But it was only moved out, it was not moved out to Shoreline because there was a plan to use it at Shoreline. It got moved out to Shoreline because it was the cheapest place to move it to. It was the shortest distance to move it to another city-owned property. And then, of course, it had this association with Shoreline. People expected Shoreline to do something with it. But the original Shoreline plan wanted to have very modern architecture in Shoreline. And it wasn't until later that we were able to, and Glenn Lyles was prime in this. And Glenn recognized that you had to have a picture. That's why he had, can't think of her name, Roberts, create that drawing of the Rengstorff House so that people could visualize it, because it looked so horrible up on blocks out at Shoreline that nobody could give it a good visualization. So that was one of his tactics to bring it to the house, and also trying to bring in all of the friends of our house and other people that, you know, hadn't been successful year after year after year, but he kind of laid it out to him and said, look, if you vote to save this house, here's the plan. It's within Shoreline's budget, because we found in our budget, we did have money to build a office out at Shoreline. And we said we could make this our office so that we could fit it into our original plan. It didn't have to go through an EIR adjustment. That allowed us to do it. And then it would be cost effective if we also rent it out for weddings and that sort of thing. So he said, here's your plan. It's not going to cost that much to restore the house. We can restore it. We can use it as our office. If you don't vote yes, tomorrow morning it'll be burned down. And he just laid it out, because year after year after year, it was a failed attempt to try to save the house or do anything with the house. And it was becoming worse and worse sitting out there on the cribbing. So he kind of made the big gamble and it worked.
Well, thank goodness for brinkmanship. Jean, do you want to say anything quickly? We're gonna wrap it up here. Do you want to have any comment about the brinksmanship that occurred? Were you sitting in the council chambers on the edge of your chair, biting your fingernails, or were you confident that this would be a successful effort?
I think rallying the people there and having enough people there to make a statement helped push it through, and thank God it did. I can't imagine having them burn it down after all the people that have wanted it to be restored. There was a lot of backing, so I'm grateful for that.
Well, we'll end our presentation on a happy note that activism and community engagement really can make a difference in saving our past and ensuring that we have a future. So again, everyone on the panelists, I won't name them all because there's quite a few here, but in any case, I really appreciate the effort and the energy that went into the presentation. I will say to Christina and Martha, you did a wonderful job, and we really appreciate the efforts that you put forth to have a wonderful meeting today. This is great. We still have 34 people participating, so obviously we have some interest in it. And for my case, I haven't had my lunch, so I'm hungry, but I couldn't bring it to a close because it was such an interesting presentation. So in any case, thank you everyone for attending. And for those people who are members of the Mountain View Historic Association or would like to join, again, go to our website. And our next general meeting will be August 1st, Sunday, and we will have more information about what that will be. We hope we have a presentation as exciting and as interesting as this one was today. So again, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday afternoon. And we really appreciate your time, Christina, Martha, and the other people from Friends of Rengstorff House and the city. Thank you so much.